Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Bobby. This thing's extra loose today. Do what? Probably. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, didn't he dropped it, stretched it all out for me. Well, good morning. Time to begin. On Wednesday night we wrapped up our study of the actual text from the book of Judges. So this morning we're going to go kind of do a little bit of a review over the book, but mainly kind of cover some of the themes from the book of Judges that we've talked about throughout the class, but spend a little bit more time focusing on those this morning, and then on Wednesday we'll have a flex period or a review of the overall book itself. Before we dive into our study this morning, let's bow, if you would, in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this another opportunity to come together, to open up your word, to study it. We ask that as we conclude our study of the book of Judges this morning, that we are able to reflect on this dark period of time. We're able to take lessons from it, to know how not to act, not to behave, but to cling to you, to have faith in you, and to ultimately solely rely on you for our deliverance. Help us not to put up things in our lives that we cling to instead of you. Help us not to look to do what's right in our own eyes, but to look to you and your word for guidance throughout this world. We ask that we be examples to the people around us and have a greater influence on them than they have on us. And help us to make disciples of all the nations and make this your kingdom. We thank you so much for your Son and the ultimate example that he sets for us. Help us to look to him as the author and finisher of our faith. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right. So we've finished the book of Judges. What's your overall impressions on this text? Everybody had a good time? Gary was saying how it shows how people can morally decline if no one steps in to try to cut that off. What else? What are some other things that you all thought about while studying this book?
Consequences of sin is individually, it can be for a group or a nation.
Okay. So the consequences of sin, both at the individual level and at the corporate level. Very good. Sure.
Out in the hinterlands, just trying to live his life, and all this is going on with the rulers and the judges and the political unrest and all that. I wonder, did he in some cases hold true to Jehovah, or were there pockets of people who had a good priest and
Sure.
were still learning the old law and trying to do right?
Yeah, obviously we don't have the narratives of every single individual that's living in Israel at this time, but that's part of the appendix to the book of Judges. The last 5 chapters there, starting in chapter 17, kind of shows what's happening with Joe Israelite. They're not faring any better, right? They're setting up their own way of worship. They're setting up their own idols. They're truly doing what seems right in their own eyes. I think that's kind of how it's played out with those. The last 5 chapters, not having an actual cyclical judge that's covered, but really what's happening in the nation at large. And the whole point of those stories, remember the last story, starting in chapter 19, nobody's named, right? There were no names given to any of those individuals in that last story, so they are kind of standing in as representations for what's happening with the nation as a whole. And specifically, I think we hinted on this a little bit, and we might touch on it again this morning, but both of those stories, to wrap up the book, there's a Levite that plays a central theme in that, right? And who were the Levites? Yeah, the priestly tribe. They were supposed to be ultimately God's representative amongst his people, right? And you can see 2 things in that story, both their moral degeneration, how they've kind of slipped, but also the contempt that the people seem to have for the Levites and the lack of respect that they ultimately have for them as well. Because both of those Levites were kind of said to be nomads, right? They weren't living in their Levitical towns. They were just wandering around, looking for work. When the Levite and the last story goes to the town of Gibeah, no one shows them any hospitality. And the men actually cry out specifically for that man to come out so they could rape him. So you see the way that the people are starting to approach the people or the godly representatives amongst themselves there as well. Very good. So here's some of the main themes that I kind of picked out as we went through our study through the book. Overall, I think one of the major points of the book of Judges, and it is an overwhelmingly negative book, is the Canonization of Israel, right? The people were supposed to come into the land and be representatives of God to those people and overtake them, but it ends up working in reverse to that. The last part of the book, really, the last 5 chapters hits this theme of the people doing what's right in their own eyes, right? They take morality into their own hands. They forsake the Lord and continue to look to themselves for answers. And then, like has already been pointed out, the overall downward direction of sin. That when you kind of give a foothold to sin in your life, it seems to have this cancerous effect where it just takes over, and then it just gets worse and worse, both at the individual level and at the corporate level as well. Then the importance of godly leadership is kind of a main theme. We start off the book of Judges with a very godly leader in Joshua, and then we end with not so much in Samson, right? And that's how it the downward trend that we see there. And then lastly, and this is the overall, I think, positive point to take away from the book, is God's undeserved grace that he extends to his people throughout the entire narrative, right? None of these people definitely don't deserve God to intervene on their behalf, but time and time again, he does just that. He steps in, he takes pity on his people, it says in chapter 2, when they start to groan and to cry out to him, and then he is able to have compassion on them and step in and raise up a deliverer for them. So those are some of the main themes from the book of Judges. So let's talk through those in a little bit more detail. On the Canonization of Israel. When Israel came into this promised land to take it, what were they supposed to do? Annihilate the heathen nations that were there, right? Take them, drive them out. Destroy the idols. Anything else? Not to intermarry with them, right? And what's the point of all of these things?
Don't take the children of Israel away from their God.
Yeah.
That's why he told them the damage is going to be. Don't intermarry, don't take up their idols.
Yeah, it was, that things like they're supposed to go in and take possession of the land, to drive out the inhabitants of the land, not to intermarry, to continue to serve God, to keep the law, it says several times. But yeah, the point of all that was to maintain their covenant relationship with their God, right? They're moving into this land where there are these other pagan deities, and God tells them, hey, if you don't take care of this, it's going to be a problem for you. They're going to be snares and traps for you. They're going to continually drive a wedge between you and me, to the point where I think one of the books that I've read was "Till There Was No Remedy," right? That's what it was called. That's, I think, referring more to the time period of the divided kingdom, but till there was no remedy.
And God was serving two purposes, it looks to me.
Mm-hmm.
His wrath was against these 7 primary heathen nations, and it was time that he was going to see that they're done away with, but they would not.
Yeah, several times in Deuteronomy, and Paul references this several times in specifically in Romans, but the point of them coming in to take possession of the land wasn't the Israelites' righteousness. It wasn't like, here's your gold star for being so good, as compared to these other nations. So here's your possession, here's your inheritance. It was actually a judgment on those nations, right? And so in the theme of Israel becoming Canaanized, What should the result of that be? If God was using Israel to judge the Canaanites, and then Israel becomes like the Canaanites, what should be the natural thing to come out of that? They should be destroyed. They should be judged, right? That's exactly what happens. God gives them over into their hands.
God helps them, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's constantly God using an unholy people to carry out his holy judgment on these other nations, both in the case of Israel to the Canaanites and the Canaanites to the Israelites. Very good.
Another purpose of that was to fulfill the promise that God had made.
Yes.
And keeping that promise was vital.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the study from the God keeping his promises standpoint, both in the positive and negative aspects of those promises, right? This is your land, I'm going to give it to you, but when you fail to keep my commandments, there's gonna be judgment, there is gonna be punishment, you'll be driven away. And then there's the ultimate promise of no matter how far away I drive you and you go, and you call out, I'll bring you back. Some of the things that they were not supposed to do. They were not supposed to intermarry, as we've already kind of referenced. They were not supposed to serve after these other gods. And more specifically, they were not to forsake their own God. They were supposed to cling tight to him, to keep his law, to keep his commandments, and to serve him only. So in short, Israel was supposed to be the dominant influence when they come into this land to possess it, come into this land that God was blessing them with. They were supposed to go into the land and make it God's kingdom. Right? They were supposed to go in, make it God's kingdom, make it theirs, make it God's, and ultimately take over and be a representation of him in this land. Very similar kind of layout to Matthew chapter 28. If you want to turn over there and look at that with me really quickly. If you want to make application to the New Testament here. Matthew chapter 28, passage that we all know very well. Starting in verse 16, it says, "Then the 11 disciples went away into Galilee to the mountain which Jesus had appointed for them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, 'All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all the things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age.' Amen." So what are the comparisons there between Jesus' commission to his disciples and what the Israelites here were supposed to do moving into the promised land? Okay, so by contrast that they were supposed to stay a nation versus Jesus going to the whole world, right? What else?
Purge that land, that good land flowing with milk and honey has idols in it, other gods that they're giving their allegiance to. So when you go in, you tear those idols down, don't even look at them. Destroy them.
Okay, so get rid of all worldly influence amongst them. Take out all those idols. The commission is to go, right? As a positive, go in and do this thing, right? God tells the people to go in and take possession of this land that I am giving you. It is yours. I will be with you if you'll take it. The same thing you said to Joshua. Be of courage. Have faith. Keep the commandments, right? Just like we're being told here. Keep the commandments. You go in and do this, and I'll be with you, and I'll bless you in this endeavor. Right? And so Jesus is telling his disciples the same thing. Go and teach to the people to obey the commandments, and lo, I will be with you. Right? So there's this understanding that God is with you in this endeavor, and if you stick with him, it'll bear good fruit. So the more we become Canaanized, though, the less effective that mission becomes. Right? When we give into the influence of our own world and become indistinguishable from it, the more we become like Israel here in this story and have little effect on what they're supposed to do. Yeah, Bobby?
They were inquiring if God was going to be with them. And against the tribe of Benjamin.
Right. Yeah.
Told him more than once, 2 or 3 times, to go up against him, and I'll be with you.
You know, it's funny, Bobby mentioned about whenever the people went to God to inquire, and they went up to 3 times, right? You know, about, you know, should we go up and fight against Benjamin? How is it supposed to go? What was the first thing, though, that they asked? You remember when they went to God the very first time? Who should go first? And what was God's answer to that? Judah. Judah always goes first, right? And it's the same thing plays out in Christ's life. You know, Christ of the tribe of Judah. Judah always goes first and leads the charge in the vanguard. Very good.
I do think it's interesting here that not only did Israel become more like Canaan, their view of God became more like Baal.
Yeah.
I think one of the strangest things, which shouldn't be that strange, I guess, it happens to us too, is God presents a very clear picture of who he is and what he expects of his people and how he expects his people to represent him as he is, not as we want him to be or any of those kind of things. But what we see continually in the book of Judges is more and more they view God as just like another Canaanite god. In fact, by the time you get to Jeph, he can't hardly tell the difference between Jehovah and Baal,
Right.
other than Baal is a different god.
Yep.
You know, and so even when he becomes, you know, the anti-Baal kind of guy, Gideon himself takes on that name, you know, of against Baal. But the Jehovah they represent is more like Baal than the Jehovah that as he is.
No, that's a good point. We'll talk definitely more about that in just a second. But Scott's point being their religion even deteriorates in and of itself to where when they become Canaanized, their religion is also Canaanized, and they approach God like a foreign and pagan deity, and that it's almost like this trickle-down effect where more of the same causes more of the same. Very good. So they move into the land. What actually happens? Right? They were supposed to go in and take possession of it, be the dominant influence. What occurs? Yeah, they fail to adhere to God's word, his commands, and to drive out the inhabitants. And they ultimately become the ones who are influenced by the people around them instead of them being the ones who are having influence over the people. So they start giving in, they start giving footholds away, they start conforming to the people around them. And what's the end result of that? So they start conforming to the likeness of the nations around them, and everything good? They start worshiping the gods of the land. But I mean, does that work out for them? I mean, they do it because they want to, right? Because it's easier to go this route. This seems better in their own eyes. Is it better? How does that play out in Judges? What happens next in the cycle? Yeah, the very nations that they long to be like ending up being the nations that oppress them, right? So these attitudes, these desires that they have for themselves because they know what's best for themselves, end up being the very things that enslave them, end up being the very things that dominate them and take control over them. And it's interesting, with the very exception, or the only exception of Othniel, who was the very first judge. If you remember when we talked about him, it said that it was King Cushan-Rishathaim, who came from Mesopotamia, and his name means, dark or doubly evil. Apart from him, all of the other kingdoms that end up oppressing the Israelites were local, right? So these are the next door peoples that were coming in and taking over them. But because they continued to give them foothold, they end up being, like I said, cancerous earlier, and they end up taking over and becoming the dominant influence among the people, to the point where they truly become indistinguishable from the Canaanites around them, like Scott mentioned. And in Judges chapter 10, right before Gideon comes on the scene, God is having this inner dialogue with his people through the prophet, or actually, I think that was the one that was actually directly talking to his people in chapter 10. But he says, you've gone after these nations, and he lists off 7 different nations, right, and 7 different gods. And what was the point of that? The number 7, and listing out those 7. Yeah, completeness. You have wholly turned away to them. You have wholly turned aside and gone after these foreign nations and foreign gods. And then you've got the town of Gibeah, in chapter 19, where the parallels between that story and the story from Genesis chapter 19 with Lot are, almost identical. And so this Benjamite town is Sodom, right? Has become Sodom. So you see how they have become completely indistinguishable from the nation that they were supposed to go in and completely influence to the point of changing them to be, or this land to be God's, but now they've become indistinguishable from Canaan. They start to deal treacherously with their own people, right? As we kind of progress throughout the book, you see how they start fighting amongst themselves. You've got Gideon, who's portrayed at times as being a good and faithful man, but he goes off on this revenge crusade, going out and attacking and killing everyone who ever wronged him along the way. You've got Abimelech, his son, killing his 70 brothers all at one place on one stone. The people of Shechem who are, encouraging him and paying him to do it. You've got the people casting out, or the brothers in the town of, or people of Gilead casting out Jephthah, right? Just completely turning him aside, turning their back on him, even though he was truly their flesh and blood. You've got the Danites who were basically, that's in the section where it talks about them doing what's right in their own eyes, but truly doing just that. You've got some cool gods, we want those, we're going to take them. And we're not going to stick to this land that we were supposed to possess, we're going to go try to take this unsuspecting town. You got the people, obviously, of Gibeah, who clearly just follow their own base animalistic instincts and carrying out their wicked deeds. And then, like Scott mentioned just a second ago, the people ultimately start to treat Yahweh like this pagan deity. They turn the God of the covenant into another god in the land. And like he mentioned, you've got the story of Jephthah. And whenever Jephthah is talking with the oppressing king, he says, well, your God Chemosh gave you your land, and our God Yahweh gave us this land. Shouldn't we just let the gods settle this? Isn't that enough of an argument to say this is yours and this is mine? So he likens the one true God to being like another localized pagan deity. And so you see how that's just kind of started to infuse with their own culture and their own religion and their own understanding. And you've got good men like Gideon who start to establish their own type of religion. He makes his own ephod, he makes his own religious garments, and that becomes a snare amongst the people. And then obviously, most clearly, you've got Micah, establishing his own household religion. That I don't like that way of approaching God, so I'm going to make up my own. I'm going to take this and cast my own golden image in the likeness of God. I'm going to establish my own priesthood with my own family. And then, you know what? That's not quite as good. There's a wandering Levite. Let me take him in, and I'll pay him to be my personal priest. All right? So they kind of make up their own religion as they go, but they're constantly doing that and treating God just like this other thing, this other pagan deity among them that they can just manipulate at will to do whatever they want. And in doing so, they introduce this perverted form of Judaism that just stays with the people for centuries to come. However you want to approach God is fine, as long as you're maybe just doing it in some vain attempt. And then they start to, like the Canaanites, they start to rely on themselves for answers and for deliverance. Right, with the people of Gilead, whenever they cry out to God and God doesn't answer because he said, no, I've seen this story play out time and time again, no more. And they start to try to figure it out themselves, right? Remember the people of Gilead, before they called Jephthah, they say, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? How are we going to solve this? Who are we going to raise up to be a deliverer, instead of continuing to try to rely on God to sort that out for them? So they end up negotiating with Jephthah to try to figure out or bring him up into power to deliver them. And we didn't get to talk about this too much, but this is definitely played out, I think, in the stories of several of the minor judges, especially the ones that are listed after Jephthah in chapter 12. But they have these large families. It says that he had several different wives, and they have several different children, 30 or 70 children. And, the only way to get that many kids is to try to establish something like a harem, and you're trying to establish your own monarchy of sorts, and trying to put yourself in position and power. And it says they have wealth, they have these towns named after themselves. They're riding on donkeys. I mean, they become their own nobility, so to speak. So they're trying to kind of take this and put it on themselves to deliver themselves. But ultimately, when Israel starts to go this way, God's answer to it is to let them have it. And that's kind of the way Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 1, that when you profess yourself to be wise in your own eyes and you do what is right in your own eyes, it's really foolish, and God will give you over to that. If you really want to go that way, God will let you have it. When the people of Shechem make Abimelech king, and Jotham the son comes out and pronounces that curse on the people because of what they're doing. He says, may you guys be each other's joy. You guys deserve each other. And so, God does the same thing, and like I said, he elaborates that in Romans chapter 1. But when you want that, starting in verse 22, God lets you have it. And it is a punishment in and of itself that definitely plays out in the remainder of the story of Judges and the remainder of our lives, and we choose to do the same thing. The other big theme that we kind of talked about was doing what's right in our own eyes. Now, that phrase isn't really introduced until the very end of the book, and starting in chapter 17, verse 6, where it says that, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But even though that's just at the end of the book in the appendix, if you will, it's really the characterization of the nation and the people as a whole throughout the entire book. Everyone is determining their own morality. But it's interesting, at the start of every cycle in the book of Judges, you've got this phrase, and it's listed here for all the book, chapter, and verse there, but they said, again, the people of Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So doing what is right in your own eyes equates to doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. All right, so our trying to establish what is best for ourselves is contrary to what God has already established for us. But the seeking after that, the driving ourselves to make it ourselves is ultimately evil in the eyes of God, and it will result in our downfall. This idea of seeking after what we want for ourselves because we know what's best, seeking our own self-interest. We didn't get to cover this in a lot of detail, but in chapter 5, after the story of Bayrack and Deborah gives this song and talks about the deliverance of God or deliverance by God for the people of Israel. But starting in verse 13, she starts to list off, this is in chapter 5 of Judges, starting in verse 13, she starts to list off the nations and their involvement in this conquest. And then she gives praise to certain tribes, for risking their lives, for putting it on the line, and for answering the call of battle to come out. And then she talks about the Reubenites who just stayed home and watched their sheep. She talks about the Danites who just stayed with their ships, and forget the other one, but they were staying by the shore and the inlets of the sea. So there are these nations there that were. Yeah, I see that the people are in need, and I've been requested to come out and fight this battle on God's behalf. But I got my own thing going on. I got my own work to worry about. I've got my own well-being to make sure I can hold on to. So you definitely see that playing out in the lives of the people, doing what's right in our own eyes. Sometimes that is just sitting on the sidelines and trying to take care of ourselves. But then forsaking the lamp that God is. Yeah, Scott.
I think there's something that becomes a little more obvious if your first 2 points there, you swap them, and you just look at the progression. At first, the point is they did evil in the sight of God, and they would have known that what they did was evil in the sight of God. But by the time you get to the end of the book, that point of no king is the same point that God makes to Samuel. Mm-hmm. I was supposed to be their king. They were supposed to be following me. But really, that's what it's saying, is that they no longer even follow God to know enough that what they're doing is evil in the sight of God.
Yeah.
And you really see that transition from, I know the standard I'm supposed to be held to, but I sinned against it, to where it gets so bad that they don't even know that standard anymore. Mm-hmm. And so they're just doing whatever they think is good, and I think that's just, it's so indicative of that. If
Right. Yeah, so often, and as this point here, God's law, especially in the Psalms, is portrayed as this guiding force in our lives. All right, not just these arbitrary rules that God will set in our lives to say, I wonder if they're going to do this. No, it's truly better for you. It is a lamp to your feet that lights you, or it gives you enough light to figure out how to take the next step. And then when you take that next step, it gives you enough light to take the next step. Right? In Psalm 19 specifically, it's really kind of portrayed almost like these roadway signs. Like, and you imagine yourself driving around a dark road at night. You don't have your headlights hit one of those reflective signs and then think, man, that thing is so restrictive. That sign is really holding me back from what I really want to do. No, it's a beacon that says, turn this way. This is how you're supposed to go, right? It is supposed to be for your good. It is that standard that is established so that your life will be better for following it. But when you start to go off on your own path and you start to ignore those guideposts along the way, things get very bad and get very bad quickly. And it ends up being this kind of moral relativism that's established amongst the people. That, I truly will do whatever seems right in my own eyes. We start to determine what's best for us, not by those signposts along the way, not by God's law or God's word, but by what society dictates is truly best, or what I can see is most convenient or beneficial for me in this moment. And you're going to see that definitely played out, with the old Ephraimite man in Judges 19, where he's willing to cast out his own daughter to hold up a social custom that says, take care of your guests. He's willing to cast it. This seems better to me, so I'm going to do this a completely abhorrent thing and negate my fatherly role in order to uphold the standard of the day, which says, take care of the male guest that's in your house. Right?
That's the same way we're doing today.
Yeah.
We've gotten so far away from God. People don't know, and they don't realize, like you said, that what they're doing is wrong.
Right.
Because they don't know the difference.
Yeah, it's because, even, both in society and the culture at large, but even within the church, we start to try to dictate things for our own sake, right? I'll interpret God however seems best to me so that I can do whatever I want.
And so many man-made religions today.
Yeah. Well, that's the overwhelming point of Judges, right? It's very negative, it's very dark, but you're supposed to be upset by it. You're supposed to be upset by the book of Judges because you're supposed to look at your own life and your own surroundings and what's going on around you and also be upset, and then not stand on the sidelines, not be a Reubenite, not be a Danite, but actually get involved and do what Christ told us to do originally. Get up and go, do something. But you definitely see how with this moral relativism, and especially in our culture today, there's these truths that are mixed with lies to ultimately kind of drive us away from God. And then one of the other themes, and these all kind of interplay with themselves, but this downward direction of sin, right? Running away from God is a downhill endeavor. And it's kind of twofold, right? Downhill approach is the easiest one. It's the path of least resistance. It's a downhill run. It's easy to go that way, but it's still down. And when you go down enough, you're going to hit rock bottom. I think that's played out, Lawrence talked about this, I think, a couple of years ago maybe, but in the story of Jonah, how in Jonah chapter 1, the author uses these terms over and over again where he says Jonah, when he's trying to run away from God, goes down to Joppa. And then when he goes down to Joppa, he goes down into the ship. And when he goes into the ship, he goes down to the lowest part of the ship. And then when he's in the lowest part of the ship, it says that he lays down. And then it goes even worse there because he doesn't stay on the ship in the lowest part. He gets tossed out down into the depths of the sea. All right, running away from God, trying to distance yourself from Him is a downhill battle. And while it might seem easy and like I said, a path of least resistance, you'll ultimately find yourself far from where you intended to be. This is also kind of true in the story of the prodigal son. Right, he got what he wanted when he was enticed by the lights of the faraway country, and I want that. I want what's rightfully mine. I want to go after that. But you end up in your own slop trying to figure out how you got there. And God does provide resistance along the way, definitely as is portrayed here in Judges. And we looked at this illustration from those videos, from the Bible Project videos. But the cycle of sin isn't just a reoccurring theme over and over again. It's a downward trend. It gets worse every time. And in chapter 2, verse 19 of Judges, it says, "And it came to pass when the judge was dead, that they, that is the people, reverted and behaved more corruptly from their fathers, by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way." So every time they went into and started the cycle anew, it's almost like God raises up the deliverer and brings them back, and they experience rest. It's a one step forward, two steps back type deal. It says their fathers kind of set and established this new threshold, and the sons took it a step further, and then a new threshold is established, and then it gets worse and worse from there. And I think that's one of the things I've thought about this a lot lately. I think we're definitely seeing this play out in our culture, where we think that it's good to be progressive in these different ideas, but all we're doing is establishing new thresholds for which the next generation will do more of the same, and then more of the same, and then more of the same. And then you get this downward spiral going on, both in our society and our culture, and even in our homes as well. And this is portrayed not only with the people as a whole, but with the judges specifically. And we talked about this in one of our earlier classes, but how the judges themselves seem to deteriorate in their moral upbringings or moral thresholds. You start off with a guy like Othniel, who is kind of presented as the ideal judge, right? Nothing bad, nothing negative is said about him. The full cycle is played out. There's deliverance through Othniel. The land experiences rest. And then by the time you get down to Samson, it's not that way. Samson doesn't say anything about the land experiencing rest, and he dies with the Philistines. And his dying with the Philistines was something of a motivated or motivated by self-interest. It wasn't, I want to deliver these people. Give me strength, God, to give them one last blow. It was, I want to avenge my two eyes. Right? It was, give me just enough strength to do one more push so that I can get back at them for what they've done to me. So you can see how, just the people themselves are being led by these fallible men to take them down in this direction. Chuck, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I think it all goes back to what Joshua told them before they went in. He said to the people, "You cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God, and a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. He will turn and do you harm, consume you, and you have done you when he has done you good." And he said, "And ye are witnesses against yourselves."
Yeah.
They were forewarned.
Yep. And Chuck was talking about how in Joshua, he basically predicted that this is exactly how this was going to play out. You are incapable in your completely humanistic desires. You're incapable of truly following God, and that's going to be your downfall. And this is played out, in several of the stories, especially at the end of the book. We talked about this a couple of classes ago, but you definitely see how these small sins that seem to be contained within the house end up being detrimental to the nation at large. And I think there's a story in that for us. But in chapter 17, you've got Micah stealing from his mom. Just steals some money from his mom. What's the big deal? It's just this household issue. But the end of that story is the Danites are taking this foreign nation with the help of this false religion that they set up amongst themselves. And it ends up kind of being this pagan deity amongst them. And it started just with this household sin, this household issue. Then in chapter 19, you've got this marital dispute between the Levite and his concubine. And that ends up with the tribe of Benjamin nearly being wiped out in this civil war. And they're having to hunt wives for themselves. Remember that's how Jay closed us out last time, when they're having to wait in the fields to catch a wife. And just started off with this marital spat at home. This idea of definitely recognize your part in what's going on in society at large, because it starts in the home. Make sure to clean up your room first and just see the effects that it has on society at large. And then, like Scott mentioned here real quick, but this introduction of this pagan religion amongst the people and trying to approach God as this pagan deity, it doesn't go away. In fact, it just gets easier for the people to hold on to that. And Jeroboam, whenever the kingdom divides after Solomon's death, where does he set up his idols? where Jeroboam creates this false religion, and he says, I don't want you people going back to Jerusalem. So where does he pick? Dan and Bethel, right? And Dan is exactly where the Danites, when they moved up north and took over that new city, they renamed it Dan, and that's where they set up Micah's idol and Micah's religion, Micah's priest, right? So these people go into that really easy. So that's one of the cities that Jeroboam picks to make his new religion stick. And it says throughout every single king in the northern Israel followed after or continued in the ways of Jeroboam. You see how every single one of those listed out, they all do the same thing. Jeroboam knew what he was doing, and he played into exactly what the people wanted and had already proven to do in the past. And sure enough, they're more than willing to go along with it, treating God like this idol. And that kind of brings up this other point that we've talked about a few times, and this will probably be the last thing we'll get to cover, but is the idea of looking after and studying these judges as role models. All right? In the New Testament, the references to the time period of the judges, or the judges specifically, is relatively sparse. Most of the time the judges, when that period's even mentioned, it's just in passing, like this is a period that actually occurred. The one reference to the period of the judges that has the most information, even if you want to call it that, is from where in the New Testament? Somebody know? Yeah, in Hebrews, and specifically in Hebrews chapter 11, which is supposed to be what? What do we commonly call that? The hall of faith, right? These are the noblest of the noble amongst the faithful throughout the history of God's people. And it says, after listing off, prominent names like Abraham, like Enoch, like Moses, and then it lists in chapter 11, starting in verse 32, says, the writer says, and what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Bayrack and Samson and Jeph, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, and they turned to fight the armies of the aliens or of the foreigners. So when you read that and you try to take that thought process back into Judges, what are you probably more inclined to think? That these are good guys? That they are worthy of emulation? But what's actually the truth of the matter when you actually read the full text of the book of Judges? Yeah. Yeah, even the four that the Hebrew writer here picks are weird, right? Why not pick Othniel? Why not pick Ehud or Deborah? But he picks Gideon and Bayrack and Samson and Jephthah. Right? Not the best ones by any stretch of the imagination. Actually, the way they're kind of joined together really goes with the type of judge they were. Gideon and Bayrack were doubtful, right? I mean, they had to be prodded along the whole way. When you've got Samson and Jephthah, they were both ignorant and then kind of did whatever seemed most expedient to them, ignorant of the law of God and ignorant of God himself. But I think the point is, the Hebrew writer is trying to draw out this positive message about faith, right? And then what faith is and provokes someone to do. It provokes you to take some type of an action, and then amazing things happen when you do. And that's definitely played out in the stories of each of these four heroes, if you will. When they do have faith in God and they direct that in the right direction, good things occur. But their lives as a whole, as is portrayed in the book of Judges, are overwhelmingly negative. And and I think the point being, both in the Hebrew writer's mind and in the author of the book of Judges' mind, the point is, don't hold up anyone on a pedestal. Right? The only one you need to be looking to is alluded to in the very next chapter, just a couple verses down in Hebrews chapter 12, is Christ. Right? The faith that we're supposed to express is outward. It isn't in oneself. It is looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, and consider him and what he's done for us and the things that he's endured on our behalf to ultimately serve and to strive after him. These men are men, and they do experience and express faith at certain points in their lives, and that is good, and we ought to take a lesson from that. But overwhelmingly their lives and their character are portrayed as negative, and there's a lesson in that for us as well, right? Good things happen when we express faith and we follow that through. Amazing things are able to occur, but our own lives and the nation and the culture around us deteriorates when we let it happen, and we kind of become the types of leaders that these men overwhelmingly were. And that's all we've got time for this morning. Thank you, guys.